Happy Wednesday. Welcome back. Today we are going all over Reconstruction Part 3. So let's get started. So what you see here is another primary source, like we talked about the other day. I didn't do a great example of explaining it, but it is a picture card that shows the first South Carolina legislature after the 1867 Reconstruction Acts. So like we talked about last time, there was a Civil Rights Act created for the newly freed Black men who were wanting to enter into politics, wanting to get involved and not just voting, but being a part of their local community legislature, state level, even higher. And so this is actually in 1868, South Carolina had the first legislature with a Black majority. This image includes 63 of the legislature's members, and it was distributed throughout South Carolina by opponents of the radical Reconstruction. So I don't know if I've gone over this yet, but just to kind of, because we're hearing a lot of Republicans, Democrats, and you might be thinking, oh, this is the same Republican Democrat Party that we have today. That's actually a little bit confusing. I think one of the videos went over this a little bit, but just to remind you that the modern Democratic Party today, back then was known as the Radical Republicans. Okay. So the party of Lincoln was the creation of what today we consider the modern Democratic Party. Now, the party of President Johnson, right after the Civil War, would develop into what we consider the modern Republican Party. So a lot of people don't do their history and don't realize that the names have been swapped over time. So basically, the Johnson's administration helps send around this picture. And as part of our attendance assignment today, I want you to tell me, why would the people who were against all of these young Black men being representatives, why would they send this card around? What do you think was their purpose in showing this? Because obviously they're against these people holding office, but why do you think that is? All right. So now we get to the next amendment that was post-Reconstruction, or I'm sorry, post-Civil War. That's the 15th Amendment. So after we've had a few years of President Johnson letting these southern states do what they want, these newly elected representatives that were Black were saying, hold up here, you know, we're not being able to go vote the way we're legally allowed to. So the 15th Amendment made up some things. It said it prohibited governments from denying any citizen the right to vote because of race. So boom, there it is. It's saying, okay, South, we realize what you've been trying to do. And we're saying you can't do that anymore. It's illegal. The only problem with it is it's not specific enough. So there was loopholes. So states could discriminate it on basis other than race. So let's say I know that this formerly enslaved person, now this free man, never went to school because he used to be enslaved. Well, if you can't read, well, I'm sorry, we're not going to let you vote. Or sharecroppers basically being forced back into a new version of slavery because they're in debt to the former masters. Oh, well, you can't pay your taxes, therefore you're not going to be allowed to vote. So again, the South was trying to get back as much of the control as they had before. They were just doing it through shady and shadier ways. Now, again, the 15th Amendment never meant to include women, not just white women, but Black women as well. The idea of the time was that, you know, if you're represented by your husband or your father or your brother, why as a woman would you need to vote? Well, of course, now we know that that's a ridiculous idea. Thank you for the 19th Amendment. Okay, what's the reality of all these amendments, the 13th, 14th, 15th? What happened after they were made part of the Constitution? Well, unfortunately, the South and the racism that was embedded in the South, it reared its ugly head. So this is where we are now seeing the development of the KKK, or Ku Klux Klan. They first appeared in 1865, and just as today, they were white supremacists and they were a terrorist organization. Klansmen killed free people and Republican supporters and injured and threatened more. If you've ever learned about the KKK, whether it's in modern times or before, the whole idea is terrorism. I'm going to terrify you into not challenging us. And if you do, I'm going to burn your house down or burn a cross in your yard, or I'm going to kill you and lynch you. That was the idea. Heinous, heinous organization, even to this day. So many leaders that were part of the KKK made it difficult to put an end to the violence. So a lot of these people were the former governors, the former leaders in these southern states. So when we talk about the two Reconstruction plans, the Republican idea of empowering newly freed Black men to be involved in government, that would have set us forward towards what the goal of civil rights would be come the 1950s, 60s. Basically, Johnson's plan for Reconstruction undid all of that. And the way they got away with it was the actions of the KKK. So this is an article from the New York Times in the past few years. And the headline, of course, this is another primary source. It's just a more modern primary source, basically saying the top law enforcement officials say the biggest domestic terror threat comes from white supremacists. And let me see if I can see, doesn't give us a date on this, but I know it's been since like probably 2016. And if you think about that, going back to 1865 with the creation of this organization, the KKK, up to 2020, give or take a few years, that's still the biggest threat. It just really makes you stop and think. So the final Reconstruction legislation, this was at the very tail end of the Reconstruction period, was the Civil Rights Act of 1875. It outlawed racial discrimination in places of public accommodation, and this was later declared unconstitutional. So what we have going on here in these years of Reconstruction is that the South was still trying to regain the power it had before the Civil War and before they seceded. The North is trying to correct the problems that the country was facing under the institution of slavery before the war. And you see both sides that are basically duking it out at the expense of Black men, women, and children in the South. Now, I'm going to put a side note in. That is not to say that Black men and women did not face discrimination in the North. On the contrary, racism was prevalent throughout the United States, but it was mainly, how do I say this, more vicious, more intense in the South. Speaking of violence and intimidation, from 1873 to 1876, it was a campaign of violence and intimidation organized by the Democratic Party that swept across the South. Now remember, when we're saying Democratic Party here, we are actually referring to what would lead to become the modern Republican Party, okay? That's over 100 years, and anyway. They claimed they were redeeming the South from evil. One example of some of the worst violence was the Colfax Massacre. Over 150 people died when white militia attacked a Black state militia. It was the bloodiest single instance of racial carnage in Reconstruction era. So it was a time where it is people who have received freedom finally since their ancestors first came to these shores and had a legal opportunity to be in a state militia, be involved in government, and the old guard of the South, of the white control over the South, was fighting back. So we get to the end of Reconstruction, which is 1877. First things first, it was the failure of the government to protect the freed people. Um, they just didn't do enough. And I think a large part of that had to do with the fact that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated and that the new president was pro South. You have the development of the KKK, white supremacy and racism, that takes hold in the South. Governments, especially in the South, were corrupt, but even the presidency at that point was corrupt. And the legacy of violence and intimidation towards Black Americans at this time was shameful, and it was terrifying. So we're going to take a look at a video real fast. I'm going to minimize this for a hot second and go to where the video is at, where we're going to talk about, or we're going to listen to historians talk about the legacies of Reconstruction.
You can't understand the United States today without understanding Reconstruction. You can't understand the possibility of democracy in this country without grappling with the history and legacy of Reconstruction. And I think it also provides an important lens into thinking about what democracy isn't in this country today. Why there are still challenges to fully actualizing the potential of American democracy.
Our understanding of historical movement and motion should never be one thing caused another thing, and now we're here, and look at how neatly that all worked out. And so for us to understand the forces of history that move history, we need to be open to the possibility that history doesn't move in a neat line or forward progression. And that's particularly true when we're talking about freedom and equality. Progress, these things are never inevitable. They're always contested. They're always contending with forces of reaction and resistance. But studying history is the process by which we try to make sense, not just of lives and worlds long ago, but of our life and our world today.
W.B. Du Bois, in his great book, Black Reconstruction in America, called Reconstruction a splendid failure. Splendid failure. Now, he said it was a splendid failure because it did not fail for the reason people expected it to fail. People expected it to fail, many whites, because of Black incapacity. That is not why it failed. Some of the things created in Reconstruction survived. Obviously, the school system survived. Churches, independent Black churches, were born really in the South in large numbers in Reconstruction. Those survived. Black families, which hadn't existed legally in slavery, now are consolidated and survive. But the dream of a republic of equals, as Thaddeus Stevens called it, failed, and one should not mitigate that, because the failure of that was a disaster for Black America and for America altogether. It warped American politics for another 75, 80 years.
most white Southerners did not want the instability of constant violence. They did not like the Ku Klux Klan or the white terrorist group. They served their purpose, but what they wanted was stability. They got it with Jim Crow. That was the way that they could live in relative peace with each other. Disadvantage to African Americans, obviously, but condoned by the federal government and by the Supreme Court.
But even though sharecropping soon came to replace slavery, Jim Crow segregation came to replace the social relations of slavery, things were never the same after Reconstruction, because Black people knew they had freed themselves through their own efforts. And the memories of being part of that collective struggle were seeds that blossomed again and again in the future.
Even though Reconstruction was overthrown, the Constitution had been rewritten with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And those, to borrow a phrase from Charles Sumner, were sleeping giants later on. And they would be reawakened by other generations in the 20th century, demanding the enforcement of these basic rights that had been written into the Constitution, but later more or less abrogated.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound.
The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, sometimes referred to as the Second Reconstruction, often referred to as the Second Reconstruction, could never have happened if we hadn't had the first. What the civil rights movement would have appealed to or could have appealed to is not clear if that 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments hadn't been there first. The principle was still there, the legal strategy was still there. Basically, their demand was to enforce the law.
As late as 1965, when Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer of Louisville, Mississippi, went before Congress and asked the Congress not to seat the delegates who had been elected from Mississippi because they had been elected in an all-white election. She told Congress, "I'm a Black woman, my grandfather was a slave, and I'm going to keep fighting for freedom until the Constitution means what it says." What she was saying in 1965 is that the promises made in the 1860s needed to still be fulfilled. She hadn't forgotten them. And it's not only that she hadn't forgotten them, she felt that she could do something about them because her ancestors had done something about it and had freed themselves. So even though in some ways Reconstruction turned out to be a victory without victory, Black people were never the same again. The possibility of equal rights was on the table in a way that could never be taken away.
And eventually, in their legal triumphs, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the legal agenda of Reconstruction was again brought into play in the Second Reconstruction. In a larger sense, it's also the second time that the question of the status of Black America was the major point on the national agenda. And one might also say that it was like the first Reconstruction in that the political revolution went much further than the economic revolution. In other words, the failure to distribute land in the first Reconstruction condemned Black Southerners to a situation as poor laborers, basically on the land of white people. The second Reconstruction, like the first, left economic inequality largely untouched.
I don't think there can be any doubt that the first civil rights revolution coming from the Civil War, during and after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, and then the second Civil Rights Revolution in the 1950s and 60s brought progress and change, but it still remains an unfinished revolution.
When we talk about Reconstruction as an unfinished revolution, I think on some level all revolutions are unfinished. And people ask me, why do you vote? It's our political system's broken. I vote because I study slavery. I vote because I study freedom and social movements that have brought about these kinds of changes. I vote because so many people died who couldn't. I think that that's where we get inspired by history. Not because any revolution is going to come to a conclusion. More often than not, revolutions come full circle. That's another definition of revolution, is that you're back to where you started. The reason why they call the Civil Rights Movement the Second American Reconstruction, and why they call the Civil War the Second American Revolution, is that the work is never done.
Whenever we revisit the 14th Amendment, we're revisiting Reconstruction. Whenever we revisit uses of violence, we're revisiting Reconstruction. And every time we find ourselves surprised about explosions or problems or stresses and tensions in our race relations, we are in some ways revisiting that first Reconstruction and the second Reconstruction.
So here we are, living in our time, and there's plenty of reasons to despair. There's plenty of reasons to think that even if you end slavery, even if you pass civil rights laws, you can think that maybe nothing is going to change. But if people had thought that in 1859, there would never have been the first Reconstruction. If people had thought that in 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, there wouldn't have been the second Reconstruction through the Civil Rights Movement. And if we think that today, we guarantee there will never be another Reconstruction to try to fulfill these promises. And that would be a great tragedy. That would be a great loss to all of us. And the fact that we're familiar with this tragedy, with this betrayal of the freedom dreams of Black people, it certainly is a cause for sadness. But it's also a cause to think, we know this place. We've been here before. We come from a tradition. People of all colors and all races come from a tradition of social justice in which ordinary men and women thought it was worth risking everything to create a fair and democratic society. And the very fact that we could even know that, or that could make us feel warm inside to think that we're a part of that, indicates how powerful Reconstruction is. So the answers to these questions about Reconstruction, what its meaning are, this is a chapter that's unwritten. And this is a chapter that the people studying it have to not only read about, but to think about, how are you going to write a new chapter, not in your notebooks, but in society as men and women with responsibility and opportunity.
All right, that was a great video. I think we're going to stop here for today. And what I would like you to do as kind of just a culmination is write down, just start brainstorming on a piece of notebook paper or in a Word doc. What do you think about what they were saying about the first Reconstruction era, the second Reconstruction era, or what we know in modern times as the Civil Rights era, and what's going on today? Are we possibly in the third Reconstruction era for fighting for equality amongst all races here in the United States? I'm very curious to get your thoughts on that. So jot down a couple things. Doesn't have to be pretty. You can send me a snapshot of what what you write down on notebook paper, or you can make a Google Doc and send it to me. But what do you think about it? Are we now entering into the third Reconstruction era? So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will catch you all tomorrow. Have a great day, guys.